U.S. President-elect Donald Trump is sending a political message to BRICS countries that he's not simply going to accept the current situation.
Now, that's the view of Chris Opperman, the operating partner at Washington-based C5 Capital and a specialist in investment facilitation, diplomacy and international relations in Africa and the Middle East.
Trump at the weekend threatened 100% tariffs against BRICS nations if they sought to undermine the U.S. dollar in global trade.
Trump said the United States required commitment from BRICS nations that they would neither create a new BRICS currency or back another currency to replace the U.S. dollar in international trade.
The South African government has done the right thing so far by the fact that President Ramaphosa has phoned President Trump. The 15-minute conversation went well. Fact of the matter is that President Trump is a transactional leader that's going to react on personal relationships, and I think that's a first step that I think is going in the right direction. Secondly, I think the fact that Ambassador Rasool has been appointed now and is going to Washington is timely. He's the right choice for America. I think he knows the United States well. He knows how to play both sides of the aisle. And he can't go at a better time. So he will hit the road running. And I think from that perspective, South Africa must then focus on the relationships, must also focus on the G20 chairmanship that is offering an opportunity for South Africa to set an agenda that will bring it into contact with the United States in the next 10 months. Hopefully, President Trump will visit South Africa, and hopefully South Africa will set an agenda that will focus on the relationship with the Trump administration and do the things that is important for South Africa to reset the relationship. Make no mistake, I think the relationship is in trouble at the moment. South Africa has, over the last 2 years, made certain pronouncements and have done certain things that have created suspicion in the United States that the relationship, that South Africa is positioning itself in opposition to U.S. interests. And I think the next 10 months must be used to reset the relationship and make sure that those messages are conveyed in the right way.
For more, we speak to our U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease live for us from New York. Sherwin, good evening to you. Thanks so much for your time. We saw the rand wobble somewhat on the news from the tariff threats from the incoming U.S. president, and we saw a quick clarification from the South African government that there is no plan for BRICS common currency, but rather discussions that could see BRICS nations trade amongst themselves using their own currency. So how far do these clarifications go in terms of assuaging the current posture from the president-elect Trump?
Well, it begs the question, really, Bongawe, as to whether Trump's tweet should be read based on the words that we read in those social media posts, or whether there is a broader message, a political message, as Chris Opperman pointed out in our discussion earlier, that one should be reading into here. Let me tell you what Chris also said. He said, I think no amount of explanations are going to change the fact that we are in a new global competition. So if you want to understand Washington, you must understand that Washington is now in a great power competition with China, and that is the reality that we cannot ignore. And so going forward, we have to see everything through that prism, this broader relationship between the global powers and where we fit in, right? We've heard South Africa talk about its non-aligned nature and neutrality in terms of the geopolitical divides that frame some of the debates today. The question is, does Trump see it that way? Does the incoming administration of the United States, are they willing to say, hey, you have sovereignty, you have the ability to choose your relationships and say what you want? Or are you going to continue to see tweets or social posts as in the vein that we saw over the weekend? It's also something I put to the president of the South Africa Chamber of Commerce here in the United States, the president of that outfit, Neil Diamond. This is what he said in terms of what South Africa needs to do moving forward. Let's watch.
The US roughly does about 25 billion trade with South Africa. It's our second largest trading partner. If we look at the net between the import and export from the US, there's about an $8 billion benefit to South Africa's side on that trade. And if we look at a rough currency conversion, that's anywhere from 140 to 160 billion South African rand flowing into our economy annually. Up and above that, the US has got foreign direct investment into manufacturing and mining, which are two major drivers of employment in our country, to the tune of 7.5 billion US dollars. That's about another 150 billion South African rand. So we're talking about upwards of 300 billion rand to which this relationship benefits us. It creates employment. It sustains our economy. It allows for economic growth, all the boxes that our government needs to tick to keep the people of South Africa happy. So where does that put us? I really think that the South African government needs to take a strong focus in terms of on which side of the bread we want to see butter. And if we look at our relationship with the US, it's definitely an important relationship. It definitely adds significant value to our country. And I think the advice would be for incoming Ambassador Rasool, for which we are extremely thankful. He's a well-versed diplomat. He's had experience in the US before, is to pick up those relations. Let the US know that South Africa is an ally. We are a sovereign nation, and that should be respected. But in terms of an overall global trade and commerce relationship, South Africa is not an enemy.
Neil Diamond there, the president of the South African Chamber of Commerce here in the United States. But further to my discussion with Chris Opperman of C5 Capital, he says South Africa, Bongiwe, should focus on the totality of the relationship with the United States rather than focus on providing explanations or clarifications, focus rather on areas of mutual interest. He mentioned modular reactor technologies. Can there be a nuclear framework signed between South Africa and the United States? Can there be a transaction around the provision of hydrocarbons and support of South Africa's gas infrastructure, and discussions around critical minerals, who are very much going to be a big focus of South Africa's chairmanship and presidency of the G20. How can South Africa best demonstrate to an incoming Trump administration that it's open for business? And remember, this is a transactional president-elect. What is of benefit to him is what's going to frame the debate here, given his ideology of America first, which is to play to his base in America, right? These strong tweets talking about we are not going to be suckers anymore. That's very much for a domestic audience, but it's also kind of hits you as a disrespectful tone in international relations. This is what you're going to have to deal with over the next 4 years once Trump is sworn into office on January 20 next year.
And staying with, America first, Sherwin, BRICS nations don't seem to be the only countries in Trump's tariff crosshairs, right? You see one of the members, for example, the targeting of China. You're looking at Mexico and Canada, to mention a few, over a variety of concerns, from immigration to drug flows into the United States. And it also raises some serious questions around the individual sovereignty of nations to conduct their international affairs as they see fit, while confronting an America First policy. So this surely, as you now alluded to, makes for a bumpy ride, not so?
I mean, what did we see before he tweeted about BRICS? He was targeting China, he was targeting Canada, he mentioned Mexican tariffs. And what did we see the Canadian Prime Minister do? Hop on a plane and fly down to Mar-a-Lago for a private discussion with Donald Trump. So, ignore the noise you might see on social media. It is going to be about those personal relationships. And it's something, the question of sovereignty is a question I put to Chris Opperman. This is what he said about sovereignty.
What I'm understanding from the United States is that they would want to work with countries that cherish their freedom and cherish their sovereignty. And I think that is the same kind of values that have brought President Trump to power in the United States, is that will to be independent and to have a sovereign foreign policy. So it all depends on what you do with that. The suspicion in Washington is not that South Africa is acting in a sovereign way. The suspicions are that we are beholden to China, that we're starting to become beholden to Iran and Russia, that they are funding political processes in South Africa, and that it's a pay-for-play situation. And so it's quite the contrary. There's suspicions that South Africa is not acting in a sovereign way. Now, of course, we have an opposite view to that about that. But those, unfortunately, are perceptions that are at play in Washington, and we need to deal with those perceptions.
And Bongiwe, just a final thought here. A very interesting, fascinating discussion there with Chris Opperman. And among the points he was making is that South Africa, he floated the idea that South Africa should start thinking beyond AGOA, right? The big emphasis in terms of the U.S. relationship has been South Africa's re-inclusion in the renegotiated and authorized AGOA, which comes up for reauthorization next year, 2025. And he says South Africa should start thinking beyond AGOA and maybe start looking at a bilateral free trade agreement that demonstrably shows benefits for both South Africa and the United States. He makes a broader point that Donald Trump is not a fan of multilateral agreements. So when you see yourself in a collective, one might fall by the wayside. South Africa might want to assert itself here and start thinking about a bilateral free trade agreement with the United States and use its position currently as the leader of the G20, to which Trump is likely to visit next year for that summit, that heads of state summit in November, and use that as leverage to really create the space here for a new relationship going forward. But that's just one person giving some advice to the South African government, Bongiwe.
Interesting times ahead, Sherwin. Thank you very much for that comprehensive update there. That's our U.S. correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, live for us in New York.